Everyone, thanks for joining us today. I'm Rebecca Tweed. I'm the executive director here at All Tech is Human. We're a nonprofit. We're based in New York City, and we bring together a global community of about 50,000 people. Together, we're building the world's largest multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary network in responsible technology. So we emphasize leveraging the collective intelligence so that we can most effectively tackle thorny tech and society issues in order to co-create a tech future that's aligned with the public interest. Our goal as an organization is to diversify tech to include more backgrounds, disciplines, perspectives, and lived experiences so that we're best positioned to meet the challenges that we face as a society. We aim to greatly increase the pace of tech consideration so that we can match the pace of tech innovation. We know tech is not slowing down. We need to move at the speed of tech. So we're building and strengthening the responsible tech ecosystem through multi-stakeholder convenings and community building, through multidisciplinary education and resource development, and through our extensive career development efforts to establish a robust and strong responsible tech talent pipeline. So we have a lot of activities you can get involved in. Check out alltechishuman.org for details on all of our programs. We have a mentorship program, working groups, a university network, an affiliates program. We have a talent pool and a talent matchmaking service. You can check out our job board. You can join our Slack community of 10,000 members across 100 countries. You can subscribe to our newsletter. There are a lot of different ways to get involved, so I encourage you to do that. And if you're tuning in right now on LinkedIn, thanks for joining us. Please feel free to drop a comment. Let us know where you're tuning in from. We'd love to find out more about you. So today's discussion is part of our weekly live stream series. We meet every Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And for this one, we are really thrilled to be collaborating with Mozilla for their Rise 25 Awards. And that's an annual event that recognizes 25 individuals who are leading the way in tech. So we're pleased to present the second live stream in our series, showcasing some of this year's honorees and their contributions to the advancement of trustworthy AI. So today we have evaluating the functionality of AI systems. This is going to be moderated by one of All Tech is Human's affiliates, Dr. Savannah Teese. And it features Mozilla Rise 25 honorees, Stella Biderman and Divya Siddharth. So with that, I'm going to be turning things over to Savannah to introduce today's guests. So welcome, Savannah and Divya and Stella.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. Really excited to have this conversation with both of you. Maybe if you want to each introduce yourselves quickly, I'll give you a minute to do that. Maybe we'll start with Divya.
Hi, I'm Divya. I run an organization called the Collective Intelligence Project. I started it about a year and a half ago, and we work on public participation and democratic inputs into different kind of parts of the AI value chain. And so we've worked with companies like OpenAI and Anthropic on model inputs, but we've also worked on the policy side. And right now we're building a project called Community Models, where we allow, we work with communities around the world to try to build their own kind of small scale fine-tuned language models and evaluate those models for their own use cases. So a lot of our work focuses on public participation, and we think about functionality kind of as downstream from that. But I'm also a huge fan of Stella and Eluther's work on kind of the direct evaluation piece.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, great. And Stella, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Stella Biderman. I'm the executive director of Eluther AI. We're a AI nonprofit research institute that focuses on large-scale generative AI, like the technology that underpins ChatGPT. Mostly we work on natural language processing research, as well as making the field more accessible to other people. So we build libraries, especially evaluation and training libraries that are very widely used in industry and academia, and generally strive to make this very domain-specific and an expensive field easier for smaller organizations to break into, as well as promoting public access to technology. Kind of at its core, we believe that the responsible development of AI technology doesn't look like a handful of tech companies telling the world what to think about it, and rather looks like people who don't have a financial incentive in the commercial success of the technology to be doing independent research, and that's kind of the world we strive to build.
Awesome. Great. I'm so excited to talk with both of you. I'm a physicist by training, and I'm very interested in many different facets of evaluation, from the technical side to more of the community side, like you spoke about, Divya. So really excited to talk to both of you. So you've both discussed in your work, and I think a lot of people in the room would agree, that AI, especially our current paradigm of very large foundation models and language models, are profoundly transformative, but also in some ways risky technology. You've both written about different types of AI risk. So I'd like to start off with maybe asking what you each think makes this kind of technology unique. What is unique about what's happening in AI right now? If anything, maybe you think it's similar to other technical revolutions. And yeah, you can speak about, is it how we're thinking about AI? Is it the social impact it's having? Is it something about the technology itself? And we can start with Stella.
Well, that's a very broad question. It's definitely the case that the technology is different from previous technology. In some areas, like in natural language processing, it has capabilities that previously developed models don't have. In terms of text generation, I mean, we've never really had, for a couple years ago, programs that were able to be useful to most programmers on a day-to-day basis in their job, and that's something that software developers and engineers tell me all the time. People are using it to do to write or edit papers. There's other areas where people are using this technology in ways where we have had technology that was able to do this before. In translation, maybe it's more capable. It's kind of the same core type of functionality that had previously existed. The other thing that I think is really different is the engagement with the public, where these technologies are getting a lot more traction and a lot more attention, both by the general public as well as by potentially malicious actors. So, we see a lot about people using these technologies to do things like, there are a lot of news articles about the potential to use the text-to-image type technologies to generate like non-consensual pornography. Absolutely a problem, 100% a problem. That's more a social problem than a technological problem, in the sense that, or it's more of a social change than a technological change, in the sense that such technologies have existed and have been able to be run on a personal laptop for like the past decade, but kind of the widespread knowledge of the existence of the technology kind of didn't exist previously. And so, the way that we're engaging with it, the fact that people are talking with chatbots frequently, we're starting to see people talk about how some people talk about like they feel like they're in a relationship with a chatbot. Like that is a new level of engagement with, and times type of engagement with the technology that is as far as I'm aware, relatively novel.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. And Divya.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of what CIP does ends up bringing us into contact with basically members of the public around the world. And I think one of the most, I totally agree with Stella, the capabilities often outstrip previous technologies, not always. I think we can all agree the Turing test is a pretty broken metric by most standards, but it was for a while a major thing that people were aiming for. And now I think we can all agree it's been passed. So those kinds of things are really meaningful. But what's fascinating to me is seeing people from around the world just like day to day engaging with this technology very quickly. Like that change has happened very fast. Students in countries around the world like just using language models basically every day very consistently, and us not really knowing where that is going or what it means. I think there's so many fantastic things that I've seen people be able to build with this, which is great. And a lot of times kind of an expansion of agency of like, well, I couldn't do this before and now I can. But, a lot of those kinds of, well, what does it mean when people are interacting with a technology every day? What does it mean when you're building closer relationships with it? I think, we've already seen how algorithmic recommendation systems that are being built by large companies can often have at least side effects, if not first order effects, that aren't in people's best interests. And so I think there's just a lot of unknowns. And one of the things that I worry about the most, it's not actually a direct consequence of the technology, but the concentration of power that is likely to come along with it. I mean, as Stella was saying, it's a highly capital intensive technology that is currently kind of like frontier models are being built by a small number of organizations. I mean, there's open source, but even then, that is often coming out of a small number of organizations. And seeing something built by a small group spread really widely, like if that thing is great, then this could be a great thing. And often it is, but it has a lot of downsides and just things we don't understand yet. So I think, to me, when we talk about evaluation or functionality, some of that, there are a lot of things we need to understand just on the technological level, but also society-wide kind of evaluation of what is going on and what the kind of longer tail impacts are likely to be. We're often kind of flying blind in the sense that we don't actually have a good, consistent sense of like, what kinds of people are using this tech? What is it for? What impact is it having on them? And so that sense of, evaluation, or at least tracking and understanding at a large scale, I think is really necessary.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great kind of segue to my next question. Like you both mentioned, we're seeing really rapid uptake of this technology, integration with many different kinds of systems, but also individual use for potentially social connections, for military use, for misinformation, all kinds of applications. But we don't, like you said, Divya, we don't necessarily understand exactly how everyone is using this technology or fully understand what it can do. People are always sort of doing crowdsourced red teaming and figuring out new failure modes of the technology, new types of behavior that you can elicit that maybe the researchers didn't anticipate. So that's why I think I agree with you. This topic of evaluation is really important. So I would love to hear both of your thoughts on why evaluation is important and what characterizes a useful evaluation, whether it's on the technical side or more of the social context side. And yeah, let's start with Stella.
So I want to start by saying, like, there's a very core problem that makes evaluating these models in any context very difficult, which is that most people who use them want to use them in a very open-ended fashion, where the user can put in kind of arbitrary text inputs and they get arbitrary text outputs out. And if your goal is to kind of evaluate the behavior of a model at scale, meaning run many evaluations on a large-scale model, this applies there as well. But the ideal goal would be to evaluate the kind of in situ use that people have, which is this kind of arbitrary text input, arbitrary text output. Unfortunately, even in very basic cases like question answering, like factual question answering, there are oftentimes like many different equivalent ways to say the same thing, and our best computational tools for taking two sentences and asking, are these basically the same in the way that I care about, is in fact the models that we're trying to evaluate. And so this is like a really big technical challenge that comes with basically any evaluation protocol, and is kind of a major starting point, which is like, how are you going to address this? Some evaluation methods focus on kind of like multiple choice, where they say, there's only like 4 possible answers that we're going to accept, like SAT question style. And that constrains it in a way that makes the evaluation feasible. Other people issue doing large-scale evaluation and look at like smaller scale user studies and have actual humans reading all the model outputs, all the model inputs to do this analysis. But that's like in my mind, the core challenge in model evaluation is the fact that as machine learning researchers, we've gotten used to the idea that if you develop a model, you can just kind of like run a program overnight that will tell you an evaluation score. And while there are things you can run like that for these kinds of models, they have a lot of caveats and limitations that haven't historically applied to doing those kinds of evaluations in other contexts.
Yeah, thank you. That's so interesting. I've read some writing about this idea of context validity, right, around how we study large language models if they're divorced from the user. So yeah, really excellent point. And Divya.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. A lot of our work has been thinking about what post-deployment evaluations look like. So obviously some things, like if you are very worried about a dangerous capability, then it is very reasonable to really want to identify it pre-deployment, right? Because like once it's out into the world, you're very concerned about it. But a lot of the risks or like harms or concerns that we have are also post-deployment of like, well, is this kind of resulting in manipulation? What does it mean when a lot of people have relationships with AI? What are students using things for? And they're not necessarily things that even if you realize they were happening, it's clear that we should stop them, right? Like, it's not clear that, say, people have close relationships with AI. Like, I don't think we as a society have yet decided what we feel about that. And obviously people have different feelings. In fact, at AIP, we've recently worked with some partners to run like a global scale input process on features that people around the world just want to see with AI. Global scale asterisk, because it's people with access to the internet, but we'll allow it. I think there are genuinely just extremely mixed feelings about what people want out of these features. Some people are incredibly excited about human AI relationships, right? And genuinely don't see any problems with it. And possibly we feel that they should have access to that, et cetera. So back to evaluation, I think trying to understand what is happening post-deployment, like going into communities and saying, like, how are you using these things? What are the problems you're facing? We've kind of been labeling them internally as like small misalignments, where it's not really something catastrophic is happening, but we know a team that's building a gender-based, but they're building a chatbot that is trying to help victims of gender-based violence be able to like share their stories and get them logged somewhere. Okay, and they have found that they're not an incredibly technical team, and they were building off of, I forget, one of the large language model APIs, and they can't get the tone right. Like, a lot of the women who interacted with it just felt really uncomfortable with the way it was speaking to them. And it's not that this is a catastrophe. It's not the kind of thing that if you knew that it was going to happen pre-deployment, you would change anything. But it is a problem, and we want to evaluate applications based on those problems so that we can improve them. And so a lot of what we try to do is both at the like small, let's say, misalignment level, like things like this, just try to identify when that's happening and give people the tools to fix it themselves. Like, there is not going to be a top-down solution to that kind of stuff. And then also try to do these more large-scale input processes on like, well, what are the risks that people are most concerned about? What might we be missing? And I think there's a bunch of stuff that we definitely don't want, like non-consensual, sexual content, or like large-scale manipulation or things like that we can all agree that they are bad. But there are a lot of things that are in a gray area. Like, well, how do you deal with advertising being built into language models? Like, well, that's probably going to happen, and I don't think we'll love it, but it's not illegal. Like, so trying to understand what's happening post-deployment is, I think, a really open space of evaluation that like lots of different types of entities could also input into.
I love that you said, we don't love it, but it's not like it's illegal, because I think that's something that is often missing from the discourse around like how models should behave. Is like, so yes, if there's someone developing a model wants a model to behave in a certain way, oftentimes like they're welcome to restrict a model from behaving however they want to restrict from behaving. But like there's actually a large gap in between like how we as a society wish technology functioned and like what we're actually willing to coerce companies or individuals into doing. And the conflation of these two things, like when you're the person developing a model, it's easy for you to say like, or not technologically, but socially, it's easy for you to say like, this is not a use I'm supportive of, so like I'm going to try to prevent it. It's a very different question to say like, is this something that we should try to prevent people from having the ability to do it all?
Completely.
Even if we think it's wrong.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of these questions, we don't, okay, there are open questions on whether the best way to answer this is to get a sense of what society thinks. Like, obviously that's its own philosophical question, but I think that people should have input onto this stuff. And even then, we don't understand what society thinks of these problems. Like, we don't understand what people as a whole want from human AI relationships. We don't understand what people as a whole want from like the trade-off between some amount of manipulation versus having like much cheaper access to models. Like, we might feel like that is an exploitative thing in the way that we kind of feel that about some advertising systems now, but we don't have a good basis of how people are going to adjudicate those trade-offs. So I think sometimes we, as Stella was saying, we want to restrict uses, but we don't yet exactly know if that's something we like should be doing, and it's not something we've already legally committed to.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it again leads nicely to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is data. So We know, of course, data is really the foundation of these large models. They're trained on massive data sets. And so it makes sense that data would be an important component of evaluation as well. But we often don't have, a ton of insight into maybe what data sets, especially the closed source large language models, but even a lot of the open source ones, we don't necessarily have insight into what they're trained on, or what their evaluation data sets look like. And it sounds like you're also both suggesting that there's even another type of data that's missing as well to do effective evaluation, which is more around societal context, user behavior, user desires. So I'd love if you could each talk a bit about, maybe the role of data and evaluation, and how we can create better or collect better data for evaluation. And Divya, you can start.
Yeah, I mean, I think I possibly will repeat myself, but I do think a lot of what we need to do is collect data at the point of contact, basically, like between people and the systems that they are using, and also get more collective input into evaluation. Now, obviously, developing an evaluation in a rigorous way is a hard thing to do. It's not that you can just ask someone off the street to like develop an eval, but I do think that there are ways, we worked on things like participatory risk prioritization around getting a lot of people to just discuss what risks they're most concerned about and what those risks manifest as, things like that. So I think constructing just broader data sets are helpful. But other than that, I think I've already monologued about post-deployment evaluations. So I'll pass it to Stella.
Well, maybe a quick follow-up for you there. I guess, who should be producing that kind of data? I know, of course, your organization, Collective Intelligence Project, is working on these things, but do you think large tech companies should be involved as well? And if so, like, how do we kind of incentivize that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so we have worked with like OpenAI and Anthropic, for example, on some of these types of things, and also policymakers. What am I trying to say? I think existing institutions, many different kinds of them, do need to be involved. But one reason I think Eleuther is great, for example, is that we also need to construct new types of collectives to handle these kinds of problems. Now, how do we get those things like funded? How do we get them involved in the conversation? Like that is a big strategy question, basically, right? Of like, how do you create new centers of power to like do the kinds of things that might be market failures otherwise, that therefore aren't well paid for? Well, like maybe you get government funding for some of those things, maybe you get academic funding, maybe you like create value in some way, capture it, and then spend that additional value on these kinds of things. There's a nonprofit that I love called Karya that like has been working to collect language data in India. I helped work on it when I was living in India for a while, and they like license the data to companies instead of selling it. And so the people who have produced the data kind of get like consistent royalties from it and have a lot more control over it than if they were just selling that data to companies. So I think we can create new models of data collection that maybe allow for more kind of grassroots control over the data. But this is, I think, quite an unsolved question in terms of, okay, you have agreed that a bunch of things need to happen, like who's going to pay for post-deployment evaluations, right? And I think there's some amount of that that's like well incentivized by companies want their products to succeed in some sense, and so they are incentivized to conduct a bunch of these. But there will always be like things in the gaps, things in like poorer countries often get left behind in terms of like how we see the impact. So this, I think, is a big open question. I'm encouraged by like larger philanthropies coming into this space a bit more. I'm encouraged, as I said, by like grassroots initiatives and research collectives that will put this together. On the language side, I love like big open multilingual models have been being built. Like those kinds of things are great and can help with evaluation. So I do think it has to come from both the bottom up and the top down, but I don't think we've solved this problem.
Yeah, thank you. And Stella, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on like the role of data and evaluation, what kind of data we need, and also any thoughts on incentives around data, how we actually get the data that we need.
Yeah, so I mean, this is really tricky, and I love that Divya like really focused on the multilingual aspects of it. Like there's an order of magnitude more evaluation protocols, data sets, whatever you want to call them, in English and Chinese than any other language. Even like wealthy, high resource languages. Like there's a handful of ones in French, there's a handful of ones in Japanese, there's a handful of ones in German. But like an order of magnitude less. And then as soon as you start looking at, I mean, really anything out of like the 10 or 15 most spoken languages in the world, it goes very rapidly to zero. And we've been working on this problem by trying to partner with academic and industry NLP researchers who live in countries that speak these languages. So we've especially been partnering with researchers in Korea to help them kind of build data sets in Korean. One really big problem that they face in trying to evaluate models is that a lot of the Korean language evaluations are really machine translated versions of English benchmarks, which kind of pose two problems. First of all, there's the possibility that the translation isn't very good or in some ways invalidating. But secondly, the space of things that people ask a language model or things people want to do with a language model in Korea and in the United States are different. And so we recently had a paper, there's a very famous question answer style knowledge benchmark called MMLU that was developed using US standardized questions, mostly like stuff from like SAT or GRE style questions. There's like an entire section on US history that's a lot more relevant to users in the United States on average than users in Korea on average. And so what we did on this project was we partnered with some Korean industry researchers to take the methodology that gave rise to this. So the researchers who built the data set, used a method to decide which exams to use, how to extract the questions, which questions to do, what quality controls to use. We kind of replicated that same methodology, but using data that was native to Korea. So using Korean national examination questions and stuff like that. And, a big piece of the question there is like, is that something that people want? Do people want, the same method? Do people want entirely new things? I think that getting buy-in from the people whose use is being evaluated and understanding, how to figure out whether something is good for them is really important. And we've been working with Korean, especially because a bunch of Korean NLP researchers reached out to us, and because we don't want to go like we're a global community. We have people in 100 different, not 100. We have people in 100 countries in our Discord server. We've collaborated with people in like 20 or 30 different countries, but we don't want to. We're a U.S. based organization. Most of our staff are Westerners. We don't want to go into other countries and say like, here's how you should be evaluating models, especially in languages we don't speak. And so we're like trying to give tools to people who do live in those communities and speak those languages to help them figure out like what kinds of evaluations they want to see, and then kind of teach them what we know about building evaluations so that they're able to achieve their kind of evaluation goals.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Stella, you've done a lot of work. I was looking at your Google Scholar last night on particularly reproducibility and the relationship between reproducibility and evaluation, particularly like how we build tools, data sets, things like that for enabling reproducible evaluations and really letting us compare like apples to apples, the capabilities, the behavior, the uses of different foundation models, different large language models. So I was wondering if you could talk a little more about that, about reproducibility, and why that kind of approach is important for evaluations.
So the models that are currently popular are not very robust to minor changes in evaluation protocol setup, which could mean the wording of the question. It could mean the way that the answers are scored, but there's a large amount of like non-robustness to the point where if two people read a paper and then go off and try to implement something that is roughly what was in the paper, they're likely going to get extremely different numerical results when they actually go and evaluate models. And this is a really big issue in the machine learning community right now. Pretty much any time a model comes out, if they kind of roll their own evaluation at home, people start trying to evaluate it, and they're like, oh, in the blog post, it was like a little bit better than this model, but when I ran it on my evaluation, it was way worse than the same model. Like, what's going on? And there's a real issue where, it's very hard to tell the difference between cases where, the evaluation is just like randomly non-robust in this one particular way versus there's, in some cases there have been fears or allegations that this is like in to some extent deliberate, that people are trying to make their models look better. And there's just a lot of worry about, how are we supposed to think about these numbers if we don't know that they were kind of scored according to the exact same rules that everyone else was. The other kind of component of this is that evaluating models is expensive. We talk about how training models is expensive, but especially for lower resource researchers, like evaluating models is expensive. And there's a very strong desire to take numbers from papers other people wrote and just evaluate your own model and compare to the evaluation that the people who trained the other model did. And unfortunately, this is like basically non-feasible because of this non-robustness. Like I simply do not believe that an evaluation that I implement, an evaluation that someone else implements, that we can put the numbers next to each other, and just because my number is bigger than their number means that my model's better. For all I know, that if they ran their evaluation code, their model would have come out better. And so we've spent a lot of time like re-evaluating models and trying to evaluate as many models as we can on the same code base. And that's kind of where the focus on reproducible evaluations has really started, those two factors. So we've been striving to make it easier for people to kind of have both trust in the evaluation process, as well as simply like reduce the amount of workload, because it's a lot of work to evaluate all of the models you want to compare to. A lot of these papers have a table with like 10 or 15 different models in them, and you don't want to have to run all of those yourself. It's costly, it's time consuming, and oftentimes it's challenging. Models are called in different ways. It's not always easy to just substitute one model out and put another model in. And so like most of our work on reproducible evaluation is like focused on infrastructure. It's on a evaluation platform that is really at its core infrastructure for here's a pile of models, here's a pile of evaluations. How do we run any model on any evaluation without too much work? And so a lot of people are also like simply not able to actually just go run on a technical level all the models that they wish they were able to do. So there's like a lot of kind of key issues that better reproducibility is able to ameliorate. Now, it's not to say that like the particular standards or commonly used practices are the best way to evaluate models. I mean, I think a lot of the benchmarks that even that I run and include in papers using libraries we've built are not very good benchmarks in terms of like the amount of credence I give to the meaning of the scores. But at a bare minimum, in order to have meaningful conversations about model capability, we need to know that like if I come forward with one set of numbers and someone else comes forward with numbers for a different model, we need to be able to know if these are even comparable or not. And that's not really something that we've had historically, or that we've had for a while. We're moving in that direction. There's been a lot more standardization. There's been the emergence of platforms for evaluations, like the Hugging Face OpenLM leaderboard, which uses our evaluation library on the back end, is kind of one of the de facto places that people are getting their evaluation scores nowadays. And us and the Hugging Face team have put a lot of work into making that kind of reliable and consistent with how most papers run their evaluations to the best of our ability and such.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's incredibly important work. And right, what you said about different research groups potentially getting different results with the same model is absolutely something that I run into in my work right now, even on physics-based models. So we've been trying to reproduce the numbers from a state-of-the-art transformer paper for physics for like a year now, and we're not able to get the same evaluations on various aspects as the original paper. So it's definitely a big problem in all areas. And some of what you were saying kind of made me think of this other phenomena that I feel like I'm seeing of sort of a hype bubble around AI, even within the technical community around AI. So I'm curious if you all feel the same way, if you see any kind of behaviors of maybe researchers like overstating, or even not researchers, more tech companies overstating or misrepresenting capabilities of AI, maybe not describing evaluations correctly. Maybe you disagree and there's no hype. I'm also happy to hear that. But yeah, I would love to hear if you have noticed this kind of phenomena as well, and like where you think that might be coming from, and if it relates to evaluation in some way. And yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I alluded to this earlier, actually. I mentioned that like there's diminished trust in evaluations. And I mean, that's because for most model trainers, the blog post where they put out their evaluation is also an ad. It's an ad for their company, it's an ad for their service, it's an ad for their product. And yes, by having a good model is the way that they try to attract business, and so there's certainly a commercial incentive in having a good model, but there's also a commercial incentive in appearing to have a good model. And I think that there's a lot of concern about this. I don't know. There are not many cases that I would look at and say like, oh, I believe this was like probably like deliberate fraud. Like that is not something that I think we're at least currently encountering. Very often there have been a couple kind of high profile cases, usually where people are kind of, packaging GTP4 and pretending it's a model they train. That's happened a couple times. But in terms of some startup training a new model and releasing scores that look a little weird, like I don't think it's fraud. I think it's usually a result of their evaluation protocol being a little weird. But kind of this concern is something that's very present in the minds of a lot of AI researchers, because it's very hard to, if you don't know people, it's very hard if you don't know people or kind of have some kind of inside input. It often looks the same. In terms of like, here's a blog post, the numbers don't make sense to me, they do make their model look really good. Like, is this because they did something weird that happens to bias towards their model, or is this because like it's fraud? And it's I mean, fraud is a strong word. I should probably not be necessarily jumping to fraud, but whether they're gaming it deliberately to make themselves look better, it's very messy and it's very hard to tell. And
Yeah.
like, something I think a lot of researchers are very concerned about and just don't know how to address, because like, almost everyone who builds models also sells those models. And that's kind of one of the big value adds that I think that ATIH has to the AI community, where like we are technical experts who have trained large scale models, and don't do that. For a long time, we were the only people in the West who could say that. There was like a couple universities in China as well. Recently, a couple other organizations like the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence and LM360 have started doing this as well. But like, there's single-digit organizations in the United States, and like maybe 10 or 15 worldwide, that have trained like a moderately large-scale model, and are active researchers in the field and don't also sell those models commercially.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great point. Like, there are so many different kinds of incentives at play in research, AI research. And of course, we've seen this with other areas of science research, like climate in particular before, but it is something that I'm concerned about as well as a researcher. And Divya, I'd love to hear, as we wrap up, your thoughts about, potential hype around AI, and maybe in particular if it affects these kind of community measurements that you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think there's absolutely hype within AI research as a community, but there's also, because there's such a huge literacy gap still, right, in a lot of ways, where when people interact with ChatGPT, not a huge percentage of them have like a really good sense of what's going on. So like sometimes when we do roundtables, people are really shocked that like, they think the model is learning in certain ways alongside them in ways that it's not. When they ask the model a question, like, what do you think of me? They think it has access to like a lot of private information that it doesn't, but also they don't think that some of their, I think people have gotten a bit more wise to like, okay, Google saves my search history, right? Like people are aware of that now. It took a while to get there. I don't think there's like that intuitive understanding of what models do, what they do with your data. So there's just a very basic sense of like not quite understanding what the technology is for most people that use it. And I think it's easier to have like more outlandish or unsupported claims in a situation where that's true, because the number of people who can check those claims are actually very small, like Stella was saying. And also many people have their own incentives for putting forward those claims. And the average person doesn't have the ability to say like, oh, that seems outlandish, or like, oh, I can actually test that and it's not true. Like that kind of gap is very wide. Sometimes that means people also don't know how capable the language models are, and they actually could do a lot more with it if they knew what it was capable of. So it's not always hype. I think it's just a literacy gap. And so some of the work we are doing, but also like would encourage lots of other organizations to do, and are excited to see when folks do it, is like trying to bridge that literacy gap and just give people a much better sense of the thing that they are interacting with. Because I think that kind of increases our societal resilience to hype, right? As has been seen in other industries before. And it also means a lot more people are capable of building on the great things that can be done, which is also something we're excited about.
I have a follow-up question for you, Divya. One kind of mental model that I've been using when thinking about this literacy gap is like the main context that I encounter this in, because I don't interact with that many everyday people in the course of my job. But the main context I encounter this in is kind of the wrong amount of trust and credence in the capabilities of models. And I see people saying things like, oh, the models don't know anything, any factual information. You can't rely on them for anything. And then, I see people being like, well, I asked it like 5 questions and it got them all right. So like that's clearly false, and then kind of overcorrecting in the other direction. The mental model I have right now is kind of analogous to like early Wikipedia. Like I'm not sure if you were in the right age bracket for this, but like when I was in elementary school, I got lectures in elementary school about how like, oh, you can't trust Wikipedia for anything. And like everyone knew that was simply not true. And it was like well motivated, and there a more sophisticated, maybe hard to get across statement was true. But the fact that we were constantly getting told like, oh, you can't trust Wikipedia for anything was kind of unhelpful, because it made like people just disregard what we were being told by teachers about kind of reliability of information. And I've been kind of wondering recently if a similar dynamic is happening with these language models.
I think absolutely, and I actually really love and will steal the Wikipedia example, because I think it is the case that people, if our critiques of language models are evidently not true for people who are just using them a little bit, where it's like, well, this is totally useless, or like this hallucinates constantly, and if on one hand I'm hearing this is the most incredible thing on earth, and on the other hand I'm hearing this is useless and never works, and then I interact with it a little bit and I'm like, well, this seems pretty useful, then I'm likely to disregard that this is useless kind of set of things, and therefore fall more into the, well, it could be capable of anything set of things. And so, coming back to evaluation, I think there's also kind of an evaluation literacy gap, right? Like when we have nuanced understandings of what models are capable of, in as much as we do, which obviously we could have much more nuanced understandings, I don't think that trickles down very much as well. And so we're not giving people a sense of like, what is a good use of a language model? Like, what are the good ways to use this? Same with Wikipedia, same with like the internet as a whole. I don't think we ever really got great at being like, let's convey internet literacy to people. And a lot of it ended up being like critical thinking in a kind of strange, like judgmental to outside sources sort of way. And then like gatekeepers got disrupted, and now we have social media and it's kind of a mess, right? And so let's not repeat that by saying like, you can only listen to certain gatekeepers, and then we have a situation where no one wants that, and then we're not constructing a like general sense of like, what is a good way to use these language models.
Yeah.
And I think letting people having this be led by people themselves, and that doesn't always have to be like purely members of the public, but even research collectives that come up, academics, researchers, etc., like having that be the forefront of kind of where exploration is, I think is really important.
Yeah.
My cat just unplugged my laptop, so I'm going to go fix that problem.
That's okay. I think we're actually at time already, unfortunately. But this was a really fascinating conversation. And I also had some thoughts about sort of how we view researchers and developers in this space, where like we're talking about, we don't always know what's going on, and how that maybe relates to trust building or lack of trust in the technology and in how people describe the technology. So maybe there's even like a literacy gap around how the research and development space in this technology even works, and like what we're able to answer and not answer right now. So much, collective education, collective capacity building to be done. I think both of your organizations are doing such important work in this space. I'm also a big fan of research collectives. I love both your organizations. So it was great to talk to you both, and I wish we could talk longer, but thank you both for your time.
Thank you for having us.
So much.
This has been great.
Awesome. Thank you.